And thank you all for coming back this evening for this special time. And we always want to come and worship the Lord anyway, but there's some special things I wanted us to do. And let me take a moment to welcome those who join us later on the internet. We're always happy to have you come and be there, but today was a special welcome because we're having, what, for lack of a better term, we're having a fireside chat tonight where we're talking about some things that relate specifically to us, to our congregation, and things that would not necessarily be something that would apply to the worldwide church or anything, but they're private, personal things, not private in the sense that it's no one's business, but they relate to us. And so you're invited to be our guest and consider with us, but please understand the nature of what we are doing. For all the rest of us, and if you were not here this morning, I want to address some things about Marvin Parkey. We, for those who don't know, we lost one of our elders last week and less than 2 weeks ago, and the funeral was on Monday of this week. And first of all, I have to confess that I was a bit shocked to come to realize that in all the years of experience that I've had in preaching and doing funerals that go with that, I've never before had the experience of one of the elders in a church where I was serving at the time having died. I've gone back to congregations where I'd served before on several occasions and done funerals for men who were shepherds under whom I had worked while I was there. But to have one fall while I'm there was a new kind of thing. And it kind of shocked me that I was not experienced in how to do that and how to go onward. That's why I told the congregation last week that I'd have some things I want to say, but I wasn't ready yet to say them. I wanted to think on it for some time and then to share with you some things that I think are meaningful and will be helpful, hopefully, to us all as we go forward. Some people might say, well, he's doing Marvin's funeral again. I'm not, and I'm not trying in any way to interject on what we did last Monday at all. And you might think, well, he didn't get to be the main speaker, and so he's trying to fill that gap at this point in time. And no, there was a previous understanding. If you knew Marvin, you knew that you could just about always know what he was trying to tell you. He was clear whenever he spoke, and he'd made clear to me that I wasn't going to be the one doing his funeral. It was a while back, and I can't exactly pinpoint the time. It might have been when he and I made that trip back to Athens, Tennessee together last year. But somewhere along the line, he just felt compelled to explain to me. He said, I'm sorry, buddy, but if I die while you're around, you're not going to get to do my funeral. He just broke it to me gently like that. And he said, John Hamm and I have been friends for life, and I believe he said contracted with him several years ago that if he's alive whenever I die, he's going to do my funeral. So you're not going to do it. So I understood that completely, and everybody has that choice, and there was no offense in it. I did appreciate that I was allowed to say a few things, and then so there was more that I wanted to say, and this is my way of trying to do that. But more than that, you see, when there's any change in the leadership in the church, the dynamism of that is such that you really cannot predict it, nor even when it's happened, you can't necessarily trace it. The dynamics of one new person coming in or two always changes the whole personality of the leadership in a congregation. And when someone has served, maybe if it were a preacher who had served 15 or 20 years in a pulpit and he suddenly died, it would be a traumatic experience for the congregation. And when an elder, particularly a leading kind of elder, has died, that's going to affect us a great deal as well. So tonight I want us to talk about the fact that a soldier has fallen. That's why, and I appreciate that Craig has led those songs that he's led along that's thematically fitting with what we're talking about. The leaders for the Lord, and in fact all of us, are in the scriptures, we're called by several different titles. But those who are faithful servants of the Lord are, among other things, called soldiers. And there's a reason for that. Soldiers are special people. You've heard me say before, I'm not sure at all how the military trains soldiers, and by that I mean any of the personnel, whether it might be a Navy personnel or Air Force or whoever, but more especially the foot soldier. I'm not sure how they're able to train those men and women now to be able to run into the face of death without hesitation, seemingly. When you see all of those U-boats that landed in World War II and the men that ran to the shore, and of course many didn't make it, but everyone was trying to do what he could, and some slogged for miles and miles and miles through the mud and the cold and the heat, as the case may have been in those wars. Just this past week I saw part of an interview of a man who was one of the survivors of that all. And he said what I always hear from people who've been real soldiers. When you try to compliment them, when you try to commend them, when you try to treat them as heroes, they have one standard answer. And incidentally, our fire protectors and our police personnel do the same thing. But when you say, you're a hero, they always say, I just was doing my job. That's what the job is. Soldiers are like that. And that's what they do. Whenever we would really try to praise anyone who's of that kind of spirit and ilk, we're likely to get the answer, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to do as part of the job. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, the Apostle Paul was writing to Timothy. He urged him in the very first part of the chapter, the things that thou hast heard from me among many men, the same commit thou to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And then he went on, and a verse later he said to him that you should always do the things that you're called to do, because in verse 4 he said, no soldier ever gets himself engaged in things that would distract him from the duty to which he has been called. He keeps on focus, he keeps on point, he understands that is what the job is, and so he doesn't confuse his life by getting involved in so many other things. He's a soldier. He's on duty. He has a task, and people depend on him. And so Paul said, you focus on what you're called to do. In verse 10, Paul turns the attention to himself, and he speaks of the fact that and there he's speaking of himself as not just as a soldier, but as a prisoner that has been taken prisoner by Satan's forces. And he said, I suffer all things for the elect's sake. Basically, he's saying, whatever comes, whatever I have to endure, whatever I have to face, whatever trial there is, I do it for the sake of the church. One time when he iterated all the things that he'd experienced, about people fighting against him and trying to kill him, and sometimes people even in the church rejecting him and being insulting and claiming they had more authority than he had, and that they were more like apostles than he was, and all those kinds of things. Whenever he's dealing with all that kind of thing, he simply says that it was a pleasure to serve the Lord in that way, and that if there's any glory that he should have received, that it really belonged to the Lord, not to himself. That's the way soldiers are and good servants are in the kingdom or anywhere else that they are called to serve. Servants in God's kingdom are like that. When such a person with such an attitude and such a willingness to serve has fallen, there ought to be a stop. There ought to be a cessation of everything. We do that sometimes when a casket passes that has a flag on it. We just stop for a moment. But the moment may be shorter than is really due. And whenever a great servant has fallen, we stop for a little bit, but maybe not as long as we should, to count the blessings that we've received because of what that soldier has done. In the case of Marvin Parkey, I think that it's essential that we validate that there's a great loss, and that it is one that is a qualitative loss more than anything that's ever quantitative. If we get to the quantitative side of it, we can say one man died, one man. But if you change from that counting factor and you try to assess what really is lost, the qualitative part of it is impossible to grasp. What all we collectively lost in that one man. Because among other things, when Marvin died, we lost a big package of courage. Courage that the rest of us assimilated and were able to use in our lives to go on, but courage that started in the part of one man. Commitment to the cause, unsurpassed. And collectively, we learned something. And one of the things that Marvin cried most for was commitment. In the meetings with the elders, he would often say, if we could just get more commitment, if we could just lead the people, if we could inspire them, if we could encourage them, if we could get them more committed to the kingdom, we could do so much more. And he never failed in setting the right example in that, because he was all things to all jobs. One of the things we're going to feel as we adjust is the elders meet in their business meetings, and when the men meet and when the church meets like this. We all have to realize that Marvin was always doing so many things we didn't realize what all he was doing. It was his commitment. He did things that an elder, frankly, didn't need to be doing. But he did them because he was afraid they wouldn't get done. And sometimes there were people who actually were assigned to do it, and they didn't. He never complained. He did it. But those things are now going to have to be ours. And the people who are assigned are now going to have to own those responsibilities. And ourselves, we have to be more committed, because we're on duty and he isn't anymore. He was dedicated to duty, dedicated to the church, dedicated to us. He was willing to make personal sacrifice for the sake of the church, and he was willing to protect other people and stand as the point man who would take the brunt whenever it was called for danger. He'd be the man out front. When these soldiers fall, they don't get replaced. Someone eventually steps up and steps in, but whoever steps up and steps in has to have time to learn and to grow and develop to ever reach a point anywhere near where that old veteran has been. But we have to accept that fact and be patient with each other as time goes on, because it's too much to expect of somebody who hasn't been there, done that, and been in the harness, so to speak, for quite a long time. Others will eventually fill the gap, but it will never be exactly the same. This church will never be exactly the same as it was with Marvin here in leadership. And when I say we'll never be exactly the same, I'm not saying that we can't be better, that we can't grow more, that we cannot exceed what we had ever achieved before, but we won't be the same, because that qualitative difference will be felt, and it'll be our loss along the way. When I try to think of what all he was to us, I guess you can't find a better term than the one that God chose when he spoke of elders as being shepherds. Shepherds are defenders. They are people who defend the flock. When Jesus in John chapter 10 talked about, I'm the good shepherd and I won't run. He said, when the wolf comes, I'll be there. When the lion comes, or whatever the enemy or the threat to the flock is, Jesus said, I'm not a hired hand. I'm not a hireling. I'm not here for a wage. You're mine, and I'll step in. Effectively, he was saying, I'll die for you. And when the time came, he did. And the consequences were, of course, immediately felt among his followers. He wouldn't have been surprised, because he told them for some time that we're going up to Jerusalem, and there I'm going to be abused, and eventually I'll be killed, but on the third day I'll raise from the dead. Peter argued and said, no, Lord, that can never happen. But Jesus had said to him, the time will come when you'll deny me. On the night before his death, he even said, before this night is over, before the cock crows, 3 times you will deny me. And in that context, in Matthew chapter 26, verse 31, he said, it has been said, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. When the shepherd is done in, when the shepherd is taken out of the picture, the sheep are totally vulnerable, and they are at the mercy of whatever the prey might be. That the enemy may be that sees them as prey. Whatever that enemy wants to do, they are vulnerable to it without the shepherd. And God had said in Zechariah chapter 11, verse 7, that statement, whenever I take the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. And that's exactly what happened with those disciples. And Peter said, I'm going back to fishing. And they just lost heart altogether until Jesus was raised from the dead. Then it changed. In this case, we could lose heart. We could become terribly discouraged. But Jesus had already been raised from the dead, and someday Marvin will be. But in the meantime, our job is to take over. Our job has always been to take over where Jesus left off, and our job now is to take over where Marvin left off and to fill that gap. but realizing that we can't take his place, but that he, in his defending role, stood in for us, as Paul said, for the elect's sake. And he sacrificed himself for the sake of the elect. It's no secret to those of us who are here local that within the last 3 years there was an internal storm that hit this church and in many ways tended to gut it. And Marvin, as much as anyone, and maybe more than anyone else, was the man with the experience and the strength to stand up and to lead, to put himself in harm's way and take a lot of arrows, take a lot of shots, but yet for the sake of the group, caring for all, whoever they were and whatever position they took, still caring. And you may not know, but Marvin was a soldier who cried quite a bit. He had a strong front, but he had a soft heart. And sometimes he tried to make an announcement here in this pulpit, and he couldn't do it without hesitating for a moment because his heart was touched by whatever had happened to someone. And in meetings in the elder's office, often there were tears from this man. He might be so proud that he wouldn't want me to tell you this now, but finally I can say what I want to, and he can't get me. No, I didn't fear him. But this was a sensitivity, but a person who would, whenever he felt that the future of the Lord's church in this place was in jeopardy, he would stand in and fill the gap no matter what it was. And he did, as I said Monday, he ate, drank, and slept what was happening to you, the members of the congregation. He just thought about it all of the time. Well, he did think about the triplets some and the other grandkids, but a man's supposed to do that as a father in his leadership role in the family too. But he hurt deeply whenever members of the church hurt. And a shepherd does that and tries to protect, as I'm confident he tried to protect in every way he could and keep the congregation going. He was our leader. He was the one who would inspire us in so many ways. Proverbs, we've studied recently here in the auditorium class in chapter 19 and verse 18, that whenever there is no visionary message that comes from God, the people tend to abandon their restraint. And there are many scriptures that allude to the same kind of a point. There are ones that speak specifically to that in Jeremiah, and there's at the end of Judges where the people didn't have a king and everybody did as he pleased. That passage in the book of Jeremiah speaks of the fact that God called the people to do right things, and then he said, but they say, this is vain, and we will follow our own plans, and will everyone do the things that we ourselves wish in our evil hearts. People will get like that if there's nobody who's present to say, but let's remember, let's do the right thing. Let's stay true to the gospel. Let's stay true to what the church ought to be. If there's no one who's holding the reins, so to speak, there's no one who's keeping us in the middle of the road, eventually a congregation veers to one side or the other. And its healthiness, like what we talked about this morning, is greatly in jeopardy. Marvin was one who wanted always to make sure that we stayed straight in the middle of the road, doing the right things, not veering off and getting cute on one side, not being restrictive and imposing tradition on this other side, that we keep a balance that was healthy and right. He felt very, very deeply about those things, and he worked hard to keep us straight. Whenever you think of his character and his personality, among the qualities that you'd have to attribute to him is that he was decisive. He was able to make a decision and stick with it. That doesn't make you popular with everybody. When people themselves are kind of on the wishy-washy side, they don't like a decisive person. When people want to be free to just do it their own way, whichever way they want to, when they want to, they don't like a decisive person. A person like Joshua who said, "You choose you this day whom you're going to serve, but as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." It's a set thing. It's a determined thing. I know what's right, and I'm going to do it. And so he might not have been as popular with everyone as he was with me, but he was decisive, and that's something that is tremendously needed in the leadership of the church, because otherwise the tail wags the dog. Otherwise, why would you have spiritual leaders to guide the flock if the sheep are going to be in control? So a decisive leader is essential. That shepherd has to be the one who makes some of those decisions and who challenges and who sets the right example for everyone. I'm not standing here, and I will not, should not say that Marvin Parkey was a perfect man. We knew him and the good side and the weak sides. But we knew also that he tried to overcome any weaknesses. He tried to live above those and do the right thing. And we honored him, being still a man, but as being a man for God and a man of God, a soldier of the cross of Jesus Christ. He was our provider. He provided that shelter and leadership that any congregation needs, and as was dependable as the day is long. Terribly consistent, always reliable, and dependable. We'll miss that. God's been good to us. His providence has not run out. It was only a few months ago when it was already known that Richard had to retire from the eldership. He wanted to, and he knew that it was overdue. But I'm not telling any trade secrets, I think, to tell you that the other two elders begged him to stay a while yet, stay a while. And the reason that they asked Richard to stay a while keeps echoing as I sat there and listened to the conversation, because Marvin said, "I'm having all these health issues, and I don't know how long I can serve." And he said, "Leroy, you know, you're having your back problems, and part of the time you're wearing a monitor that we don't know about your heart." And then those tears came, and he said, we could be at any moment one heart's beat away from not having elders. They had those discussions. Once we sought additional elders, and nothing was forthcoming. The next time, I thought we weren't ready yet still. I'll confess. I didn't argue when the decision was made to seek again to get elders, but I didn't think we were ready just yet. And then when we found that there were that many men who would step forward, and 4 were added, and we had 7 there for a few weeks till Richard did retire. And still we thought we're good. We're good now because I don't think I've said this to you publicly since the installation of new elders, but we got good men to join the existing eldership. We really did. And it has taken a while, we should expect it to, for the new elders to find their feet, to find their place, to find their roles and where they'll lead and fit in and get a feel for what is going on and things that they need to know about members of the church that they wouldn't need to know until they had become elders. All those things take a while. And God let us have a while. He gave us some months. Not only did he providentially put us in a position where we're not without elders, but he gave us good ones, and then he let Marvin continue in that role to teach and to mentor and spend that time getting people ready to do what they weren't ready to do to begin with before he let this happen. And we've been blessed. We need to thank God. We miss Marvin, sure. But we need to thank God that he intervened and he made us as healthy as we are and gave us the time so that we've got mature, solid leaders in the church still and are not in danger of not having any elders. This can't happen except with God's hand in it. I don't think that we're in this good a shape by our own thinking, but by the hand of God being involved and the influence that Leroy and Marvin and Richard have had in holding it all together in the interim until we could be at this place. He's going to be missed direly. And so what we got now is a situation where, with him having done so many things, and it's step forward time, folks. It's time for people to step forward and say, I can do this. Or to say to the eldership, where is there a gap? I want to fill as much of the gap as I can. It's time for people to step up. And incidentally, let me add that in the last few months, our deacons have been stepping up in a wonderful way. They just have really seemed to grasp this servanthood and commit themselves, and somehow they were getting ready for this next stage also. Whether we knew it or not, God was preparing them, and they will. I'm convinced they will step out and they'll take their part, and we need to appeal to everybody in the congregation to subscribe to that commitment, to subscribe to that participation, to step forward, to step up, to volunteer. And it's time for us to rally. It's time for us to move on, to move up. It's time for us to say, we appreciate what this man has done. We knew we could never keep any of us forever. And now we want to do what Jesus called us to do, to serve him faithfully, be a church that stands on a hill, whose light shines to the community and to the brotherhood too, if you will, and say we're strong, we're spiritually strong, We're not numerically strong yet, not at this time, but we can be as spiritually strong as anybody can. And we can be as united, and we can be as in love with each other, and we can set the example like nobody else can. And for the most part, we already do. We already do. God bless you. And thank God I get to be part of this process. God's good. If you're subject to his invitation for any reason tonight, we're going to sing a song. If you need to be baptized, this will be an excellent time to become a Christian. If you need to be rededicated, restored to the Lord, this would be a good time. And we welcome you while we stand and sing.